Alpha Magnus didn't look his eldest daughter in the eye as he threw the heavy, moth-eaten gray lace over her head, effectively erasing her from the world. To him, Emily was not a child, but a debt to be paid in flesh and silence, a sacrificial lamb offered to the Lycan King to secure northern iron mines. While her younger sister, Seraphina, stood in the sunlight, draped in pearls and mocking laughter, Emily was shoved into a windowless carriage, her worth reduced to a lie. It was an act of cold, calculated cruelty, a father bartering his daughter's soul for a tyrant's favor, leaving her to face a king's wrath alone. The high sanctuary sat perched upon the jagged cliffs, a cathedral of obsidian and bone-white marble that seemed to groan under the weight of the coming storm. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wet fur, ancient incense, and the sharp, metallic tang of tension. This was neutral ground, but it felt like a battlefield. King Alaric Thorn stood at the altar, a monolith of a nun, Man, carved from shadow and responsibility. At 32, he was the alpha of alphas, a king whose territories spanned the frozen north to the iron-rich valleys of the Silver Moon. His black ceremonial uniform was austere, save for the gold braiding that caught the flicker of the torches. His jaw was set so tight it looked like granite. To his people, he was the protector. To his enemies, he was the reaper. But today, he felt like a fool. "Steady, Alaric," whispered Kyle, his beta and lifelong friend, standing just a step behind. "The council is watching. The treaty depends on this." "The treaty depends on a foundation of respect, Kyle." Alaric's voice was a low, dangerous rumble that barely cleared his teeth. "Magnus sends me a ghost, a reject. He keeps the pristine Luna for a better alliance, and throws me the daughter he's kept hidden in a cellar for 20 years. The whispers in the hall are already mocking me. They say she's a monster. They say I'm marrying a curse just to keep my weapons foundries running." Alaric's wolf, Ragnar, paced restlessly behind his ribs, his golden eyes flickering in the back of the king's mind. Ragnar didn't care about iron or treaties. He wanted a mate who could run with him, a queen who wouldn't break under the weight of their crown. Suddenly, the massive oak doors at the back of the sanctuary groaned open. The crowd went silent. It wasn't the silence of awe, but the morbid, hungry silence of a crowd waiting for a car crash. Emily Vance entered, or rather, she was dragged forward by her father. She was a small, fragile figure, swallowed whole by a dress of stiff, shapeless gray velvet that looked more like a funeral shroud than a wedding gown. The veil was the worst part, a thick, double-layered lace that obscured every inch of her face, trailing behind her like a tattered wing. She stumbled on the uneven stone, her movements jerky and terrified. As she passed the pews, the whispers rose like a swarm of locusts. "I heard she has the face of a scorched crow. They say she was born without a wolf, a hollow thing. Look at her hands. They're the hands of a scullery maid." Emily heard them. Beneath the veil, her world was a blurred, gray nightmare. She clutched a small, smooth object in her left palm, a single piece of deep blue sea glass, worn soft by decades of waves. It was the only thing she had left of her mother, a woman who had died, mysteriously, when Emily was 5. Whenever the world became too loud, or the belt of her stepmother too sharp, Emily would press the glass into her skin, reminding herself that even the roughest elements could be made smooth if they endured long enough. She reached the altar. The heat radiating off the man standing there was staggering. He felt like a forest fire contained in a human suit. Emily didn't dare look up. She could only see the polished black leather of his boots. Alpha Magnus stepped forward, his voice booming with a false, oily pride. "King Alaric, I present my daughter, Emily, a gift from Shadow Creek to Silver Moon. May this bond seal our fates and our steel." Magnus practically shoved Emily's hand toward Alaric. Alaric hesitated. His skin crawled with a strange, conflicting energy. When his fingers closed around hers, he expected to feel nothing, or perhaps a recoil of disgust. But as his large, calloused hand enveloped her small, ice-cold palm, a jolt of pure, white-hot electricity shot up his arm. It wasn't the gentle spark of a fairy tale. It was a violent, soul-shaking crack of lightning. Ragnar howled in his head, not in anger, but in confusion. Emily gasped, her knees nearly buckling. She felt it too. For the first time in her life, the cold that had lived in her marrow since the day she was locked in the West Tower was being pushed back. The heat from Alaric's hand didn't burn. It anchored her. The high priest, a wizened wolf with eyes clouded by cataracts, began the rites. We stand between the moon and the earth to bind two souls. Do you, Alaric Thorn, take this woman to be your queen, to guard her life with your own, until the great hunt ends? Alaric looked at the gray lace. He felt the eyes of the 12 great alphas on his back. He felt the mockery of the world. He thought of his people, the children who needed the steel for the border walls, the warriors who needed blades. He sacrificed his pride on the altar of duty. I do, he said, his voice cold and flat as a blade. And do you, Emily Vance, take this king to be your alpha, to share his burden and his throne. Emily's voice was a fragile thread, barely audible over the rising wind outside. I do. Then by the laws of the first pack, you are bound, the priest declared. He stepped back, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. King Alaric, the veil is a barrier between strangers. Remove it, and behold your queen. The atmosphere in the room reached a fever pitch. Alpha Magnus took a half-step back, a nervous sweat breaking out on his brow. Seraphina, sitting in the front row, smirked behind her silk fan, waiting for the king to recoil, waiting for the moment her sister was finally cast out into the cold for good. Alaric turned to face Emily fully. He felt a dark, bitter resolve. He would lift the veil. He would show the world he could endure even this insult. And then he would lead her to a carriage and never look at her again. He raised his hands. Emily flinched, a tiny, instinctive movement that only a wolf with his senses could catch. It was the flinch of someone who expected a blow, not a caress. Look at me, Alaric commanded, his voice softening just a fraction, though he didn't know why. Emily didn't move. She couldn't breathe. Alaric gripped the edge of the heavy gray lace. With a swift, decisive motion, he threw it back. The lace caught the air, floating for a second before falling over her shoulders. The great hall of the silver moon did not erupt in laughter. It did not gasp in horror. The silence that followed was so absolute, so heavy, it felt as though the very air had turned to lead. Alaric Thorn didn't pull away. He didn't sneer. He froze, his hand still hovering in the air near her temples. Beneath the moth-eaten gray shroud, there was no monster. There were no scars of dark magic or twisted features. Instead, he found a face of ethereal, heartbreaking beauty. A face that looked as though it had been painted by the moon itself. Her skin was the color of cream, flawless and pale, and her bone structure possessed a delicate, regal strength. But it was her eyes that stopped his heart. One was the color of a deep, mossy forest after a rain. The other was a swirling celestial violet, a color that shouldn't exist in the world of wolves. Violet, Alaric whispered, his voice cracking. In that moment, the ugly bride looked up at the king, her mismatched eyes filled with a terrifying mixture of hope and agony. And Alaric realized with a sickening thud in his chest that he hadn't been tricked into a curse. He had been tricked into participating in a masterpiece of cruelty, and he had just vowed to be the jailer of a goddess. The silence in the cathedral was a living thing, stretching until it bruised. Alpha Magnus was the first to break it, his voice a slick, oily trill that made Alaric's skin crawl. "A surprise, Your Majesty." Magnus stepped forward, his hand spread as if inviting applause for a successful trick. "A test of character, you see. I wanted to ensure the Lycan King was a man who looked beneath the surface before I revealed my most precious treasure." The lie was so bold, so transparently desperate, that it triggered a low, vibrating growl from deep within Alaric's chest. The air in the room suddenly dropped 10 degrees. Alaric didn't look at Magnus. He couldn't take his eyes off the woman in front of him. Up close, the moon-blessed mark, that swirling nebula-violet eye, was unmistakable. It was a sign of pure ancestral power, a rarity that hadn't been seen in the Lycan territories for 3 centuries. And Magnus had covered it with moth-eaten lace and called it a curse. "You," Alaric said, his voice a tectonic shift of earth and stone. He turned his head slowly toward Magnus, his pupils bleeding gold. "You kept her in the dark. You dressed her in rags. You let the world call her a monster while you fed your own greed." "It was for her protection," Magnus stammered, backing away as Alaric's shadow seemed to expand, swallowing the altar. She is unstable. Fragile." Alaric turned back to Emily. She was trembling so violently that the heavy gray velvet of her sleeves rustled like dry leaves. She looked at him, not with the triumph of a hidden beauty revealed, but with the raw, naked terror of a rabbit looking at a wolf. In his confusion and the sudden, overwhelming surge of the mate bond, a connection that was now screaming through his blood like a forest fire, Alaric made a jagged mistake. He was a king, a commander of armies. He knew how to seize, but he had forgotten how to ask. "Is this your game too?" Alaric asked, his voice harsh with a cocktail of shock and misplaced betrayal. "Did you sit in your tower and laugh while your father brokered this lie? Were you waiting for the moment you could trap a king with a face you knew he couldn't refuse?" Emily flinched as if he had struck her, her forest green eye filled with tears that didn't fall, while the violet one seemed to glow with a dull, pained light. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat was a desert, her voice a relic she had forgotten how to use. She simply tightened her fist around the piece of sea glass in her palm, the sharp edge digging into her skin. "Answer me," Alaric commanded, the alpha tone slipping into his voice. It was a frequency meant to demand obedience, a psychic weight that forced lesser wolves to their knees. Emily's knees hit the stone floor, hard. The sound of her bones striking the obsidian echoed through the silent sanctuary. She didn't cry out. She just collapsed inward, her head bowing, the beautiful face disappearing back into the shadow of her hair. The bond between them recoiled. It felt like a physical lash across Alaric's soul. Ragnar, his wolf, snarled in his mind, a vicious, rebuking sound. "She is not the enemy, you fool!" "Alaric!" Kyle's voice was urgent, his hand reaching out to touch the king's shoulder. "The press is outside. The other alphas are recording this. We need to leave. Now!" Alaric realized his error the moment it happened. He saw the way Emily's small, chapped hands that bore the red, raw marks of hard labor, clutched at the floor. These weren't the hands of a schemer. They were the hands of a servant. Without a word to Magnus, Alaric reached down. He didn't wait for her permission. He swept Emily up into his arms, bridal style. She was terrifyingly light, as if she were made of nothing but bone and bird shadow. She didn't lean into him. She went stiff, her breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches. "We are finished here," Alaric announced to the room, his voice booming like a funeral bell. "The treaty is signed. The iron mines are mine. And Emily Vance is a thorn now. If any member of the Shadow Creek pack approaches her, they will answer to my steel." He marched out of the cathedral, ignoring the flashing cameras of the human press and the stunned gazes of the Lycan nobility. He carried her straight to his armored limousine, the heavy door thudding shut behind them, sealing them into a world of black leather and suffocating silence. As the car began its long journey toward the Silver Moon estate, the storm finally broke. Rain hammered against the tinted glass, sounding like 1,000 tiny hammers trying to get in. Inside, Alaric sat as far from Emily as the seat allowed, his heart hammering against his ribs. The scent in the car was changing. The fake, cloying smell of rotting roses, the perfume her father must have doused her in, was fading. Beneath it, something else was emerging. It hit Alaric like a tidal wave. Winter jasmine, cold rain, and the scent of ancient, ozone-rich electricity. It was the scent of his mate. He looked over at her. Emily was huddled against the door, her forehead pressed to the glass. She looked small, lost in the mass of gray velvet. "The sea glass," Alaric said softly, his voice no longer the Alpha's command, but something lower, more curious. Emily jumped, her mismatched eyes darting to him. She slowly opened her hand, revealing the smooth, blue fragment. "It's from the northern coast," Alaric noted, recognizing the specific hue. "A long way from the Shadow Creek mines." Emily's lips moved, a dry, raspy sound escaping them. My mother." It was the first time he had heard her speak. Her voice was rusty, like a gate that hadn't been opened in a decade, but it had a melodic quality that resonated in the very center of his chest. "She gave it to you?" Emily nodded once, then quickly looked back at the rain. "She said, if I held it long enough, the sharp parts would go away." Alaric looked at the sea glass, then at the girl whose father had tried to bury her alive in a gray lace shroud. He realized then that his mistake wasn't just the harsh words at the altar. It was his assumption that this was a political game. This wasn't a game. It was a rescue. But he was a savior who had already started the relationship by drawing blood. "Emily," he said, reaching out a hand, then stopping himself when he saw her flinch again. I am not my father, and I am not yours." She turned her head to look at him, her violet eye swirling with a sudden, intense light that seemed to see right through his skin and into the heavy, burdened heart of the king. "Every Alpha is the same," she whispered, her voice gaining a tiny, sharp edge of defiance. "You just want the power behind my eyes. You don't want the girl." Alaric opened his mouth to protest, but the car lurched as they passed through the massive iron gates of the Silver Moon estate. The headlights swept across the obsidian walls of Blackwood Castle, a fortress that had seen 1,000 years of war. As the car came to a halt, Alaric looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the thin, white scar running across her collarbone, a mark that didn't come from a wolf, but from a whip. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't just married a queen. He had married a survivor who was still waiting for the next strike. "I will show you," Alaric vowed, his voice a low, solemn oath. "I will show you that some Alphas build walls to keep people in, and others build them to keep the world out." He stepped out of the car and offered his hand. Emily stared at it as if it were a baited trap, the sea glass glinting in the dim light of the castle foyer. Blackwood Castle did not feel like a home. It felt like a cathedral dedicated to the gravity of the north. The walls were made of obsidian that seemed to swallow the flickering torchlight, and the floors were covered in heavy velvet runners that silenced every footfall. As Alaric led Emily through the grand foyer, the household staff stood in a line as straight as a phalanx of spears. They had been prepared for a monster. The rumors of Alpha Magnus's cursed daughter had reached the Silver Moon weeks ago. They expected a creature of shadows, a twisted thing to be pitied or feared. When they saw the petite woman in the tattered gray velvet, her face like a prism of light, and her eyes reflecting two different worlds, a collective breath was held. "Mrs. Gable," Alaric's voice echoed off the high rafters. A woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that had seen 3 generations of Thorn Kings stepped forward. She was the heart of the castle, a woman who didn't care for crowns, only for the souls beneath them. She took one look at Emily, at the way the girl's knuckles were white around that small piece of sea glass, and her expression softened into something motherly and fierce. "The master suite, Mrs. Gable," Alaric said. "Not the guest wing. She is my queen. She stays where I stay." Emily's breath caught. To her, staying where the alpha stays had only ever meant one thing: the duty of the bed. She felt the nausea of a decade's worth of fear rise in her throat. She looked at the grand staircase as if it were a scaffold. "Come along, dear heart," Mrs. Gable said, gently placing a hand on Emily's elbow. Emily flinched, but the older woman didn't pull away. She simply kept her hand there, warm and steady. "Let's get you out of this damp velvet and into something that doesn't smell of old secrets." Alaric watched them go. He stood in the center of the foyer, his hands trembling, a sensation he hadn't felt since his first hunt. "She's terrified of you," Kyle murmured, appearing at his side. "I know," Alaric said, his voice thick. "I used the Alpha command on her at the altar. I forced her to her knees because my pride was stung." He looked at his palms, the same ones that had carried her. "Ragnar won't stop snarling. He thinks I'm a monster." "You were protecting a crown, Alaric. Now, you have to protect a wife. There's a difference." Upstairs, in a bathroom the size of Emily's entire attic room, the steam rose in fragrant clouds of lavender and cedar. Mrs. Gable helped Emily undo the complicated rusted hooks of the gray dress. When the heavy fabric finally fell away, piling on the floor like a shed skin, the silence in the room changed. Mrs. Gable made a small, choked sound. Emily immediately crossed her arms over her chest, trying to shrink, trying to disappear. Her skin was as pale as winter lilies, but it was not flawless. Across her back, a map of cruelty was etched in thin white lines, the marks of a silver-tipped whip. On her shoulder, a jagged circular scar spoke of a burn that had never quite healed right. "Oh, my lamb," Mrs. Gable whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "What did they do to you?" "I was clumsy," Emily whispered, the lie a well-worn shield. "I fell. You didn't fall into a silver whip, child, and you didn't fall into a hot poker." Mrs. Gable reached out, not to touch, but to offer a soft linen robe. "The king. He has a temper like a summer storm, fast and loud, but he has never, ever laid a hand on a woman. You are safe here." Emily stepped into the hot water. It was the first time in her life she didn't have to scrub the floors until her fingernails bled. She sat there for an hour, the heat soaking into her bones, trying to wash away the scent of the rotting rose perfume. When she emerged, she was dressed in a simple white silk nightgown. It was translucent and delicate, making her feel dangerously exposed. She walked into the adjoining bedroom, where a fire roared in a hearth made of moonstone. Alaric was there. He had changed into simple black trousers and a shirt that sat open at the collar. He was standing by the window, looking out at the rain. When he heard the soft click of her footsteps, he turned. The air seemed to leave the room. Without the veil, without the dirt of the Shadow Creek scullery, Emily was a revelation. But Alaric's gaze didn't linger on her beauty. It fixed on the faint red marks on her wrists, the chafing from the heavy lace sleeves. "I have had the guest room prepared," Alaric said suddenly, his voice rough. Emily froze. You are sending me away?" "No," he said, stepping toward her, then stopping when he saw her shadow retreat. "I am giving you a door that locks from the inside, Emily. I told the staff you would stay here to satisfy the tradition. But I will not. I will not claim a mate who looks at me as if I am the executioner." Emily stared at him. The sea glass was on the nightstand, and she felt its absence in her palm. In the North, they say the Lycan King takes what he wants. They say you are a beast who tears throats. "I am a beast," Alaric admitted, his golden eyes glowing softly in the firelight. "But even a beast knows when he is in the presence of something sacred." He pointed to her violet eye. "Do you know what that is?" "A curse," she whispered. "The shaman said it was a fracture in my soul, that I was born broken, and that my wolf was trapped in the dark because of it." Alaric let out a short, bitter laugh. "Your father is a fool, and his shaman is a liar. That is the mark of the moon blessed. It isn't a fracture, it's a conduit. You aren't missing a wolf, Emily. You are the wolf in its purest form. The power in that eye is why Magnus hid you. He didn't fear your ugliness, he feared your light." He walked to the door, his hand resting on the handle. "Sleep, Emily. Truly sleep. Tomorrow we begin the work of making you a queen." He was halfway out the door when Emily's voice stopped him. "Why?" Alaric paused, not turning back. "Why what?" "Why are you being kind? You wanted the iron mines. You have them. You could leave me in the west tower of this castle and no one would care." "Why do you care?" Alaric finally turned, his expression pained. "Because when I lifted that veil, I didn't just see a beautiful woman. I felt a tether snap into place in my chest. It's a bond I didn't ask for, and one you certainly didn't deserve to be burdened with. But it's there, and every time you flinch, Emily, it feels like my own skin is peeling back." He left the room, the heavy door closing with a soft thud. Emily stood by the fire for a long time. She picked up the blue sea glass and held it to the light. For the first time, the sharp edges of her life felt a little less jagged. But as the castle fell into a deep, midnight silence, a strange, pulsing heat began to emanate from the scar on her shoulder. Beneath the skin, black, inky lines began to writhe like living shadows. The blood seal Magnus had placed on her was reacting to the proximity of her true mate. The revelation was only beginning, and it was written in the language of a dark, ancient magic. The morning sun at Blackwood Castle didn't rise. It fought its way through a thick shroud of mountain mist, casting the world in a bruised, silver light. Emily woke not to the harsh splash of cold water or the screaming of her stepmother, but to the scent of fresh pine and the soft, rhythmic crackle of a dying fire. On her pillow lay a single white rose, its petals beaded with dew. Next to it was a small, handwritten note in a bold, disciplined script. "I have council business at the border. The castle is yours. Explore where you wish. You are not a prisoner here." Oh. Emily touched the rose. It didn't smell like the rotting perfume of the cathedral. It smelled like the earth, raw, honest, and alive. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe. But as she sat up, a jagged spike of white-hot pain shot through her shoulder, radiating down to her spine. She gasped, clutching the silk of her gown. The scar. It felt like a coal pressed against her skin. She forced herself to get out of bed, her legs trembling. She needed to move, to prove to herself that she was, as Alaric said, free. She dressed in a simple tunic and trousers provided by Mrs. Gable, clothes that actually fit her, made of soft wool that didn't chafe. She wandered through the castle, a ghost in a maze of obsidian. She found the library, a 2-story cathedral of leather and ink. Books were her only friends in Shadow Creek, the only windows she had into a world where girls weren't broken. She reached for a heavy tome on Lycan history, but as her fingers brushed the spine, the room tilted. The violet eye, the moon-blessed mark, began to throb in time with her heartbeat. Her vision fractured. She saw the library, but overlaid across it were veins of red light, pulsing through the walls, through the floor, and most terrifyingly, through her own skin. Emily! A voice, ancient and echoing, whispered in the back of her mind. It wasn't a larynx. It was a chorus of shadows. She stumbled, the book hitting the floor with a heavy thud. She clutched the edge of a mahogany table, her knuckles white. The heat in her shoulder was no longer just pain. It was a physical presence, something writhing beneath the surface. "Luna," she whispered, calling for the wolf she had been told was dead or missing. "Are you there?" There was no howl, only a low, pained whimper that sounded as though it were coming from the bottom of a deep, dark well. "My lady," a guard at the door rushed in, but Emily backed away, her mismatched eyes wide with panic. "Don't touch me," she cried out. As she spoke, a faint, dark vapor began to curl from the scar on her shoulder. Looked like ink dropped into water, swirling through the air with a mind of its own. The guard froze, his hand moving instinctively to the hilt of his sword. This wasn't wolf magic. It was something older, something foul. 5 miles away, at the northern border, Alaric was in the middle of a heated debate with his council. The Shadow Creek pack was stalling on the iron shipments, claiming logistical difficulties. "Magnus is testing the leash," Kyle muttered, leaning against a stone pillar. "He thinks because the wedding is over, he has leverage." Alaric didn't answer. He was staring at the distant silhouette of Blackwood Castle. Suddenly, he sucked in a sharp, pained breath. He clutched his chest, his pupils blowing wide until the gold consumed the iris. "Alaric!" Kyle was instantly alert. "The bond!" Alaric rasped, his voice dropping an octave into Ragnar's growl. "Something is tearing at her. It feels like teeth in my soul." He didn't wait for a horse. He shifted mid-stride, his clothes tearing as his body expanded, bones snapping and reshaping with the sound of breaking branches. A massive, midnight black wolf burst from the clearing, a streak of shadow and fury racing toward the castle. He reached the library in minutes, shifting back to human form as he crashed through the doors, naked and unashamed in his desperation. The scene inside was a nightmare. The library was in shambles. Books were levitating in a slow, macabre circle around Emily, who was collapsed in the center of the room. Her skin was burning, a terrifying, translucent heat that made her look like she was made of glowing glass. But it was her back that made Alaric's blood run cold. The thin, white scars from her father's whip were no longer white. They were glowing a violent, angry red, pulsing like embers. And centered on her shoulder was a mark he hadn't seen clearly before, a serpent entwined around a dagger, etched in black smoke that seemed to be drinking the light from the room. "Get back," Alaric ordered the guards, his voice a thunderclap that shattered the levitation spell. The books fell to the floor like dead birds. He rushed to Emily, pulling her into his arms. The moment he touched her, the black smoke lashed out, stinging his skin like acid. He didn't let go. He pulled her head to his chest, radiating his alpha aura, trying to create a shield of pure wolf energy around her. "Emily, look at me! Breathe with me!" It's taking the light, Alaric," she sobbed, her forest green eye clouded with gray. "The shadow. It's hungry." "It's a blood seal," Alaric realized, his teeth bared in a snarl directed at the air itself. "A siphon. Magnus didn't just hide you, Emily. He sold your life force. This mark, it belongs to the Venom Coven." The Venom Coven. An extinct sect of dark witches, or so the Lycan Kings had believed for a century. They dealt in siphoning the power of moon-blessed wolves to fuel their immortality. He used me as a battery, Emily whispered, the realization hitting her harder than the physical pain. That's why I was always cold. That's why I couldn't find my wolf. They were eating her. They are done eating, Alaric vowed. He pressed his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. He reached deep into the bond, the tether he had felt at the altar. It was no longer a thin string. It was a bridge. He poured his own strength, his own ancient Lycan fire, across that bridge and into her. "Fight them, Emily," he commanded through their minds. "You are a queen of the north. You are mine. Don't let them take what belongs to the moon." A violent shockwave of energy exploded from the two of them, blowing out the library windows and sending a plume of violet and gold light into the sky. The black smoke shrieked, a sound that wasn't heard by the ears, but by the soul, and evaporated. Emily went limp in his arms, her skin cooling. The red glow in her scars faded back to white. Alaric held her, his chest heaving. He looked down at the sea glass that had fallen from her pocket. It was no longer just blue. It was glowing with a faint, steady light, as if it had captured a piece of the storm they just endured. But the silence that followed was short-lived. A messenger burst into the ruined library, his face pale as ash. "Alpha, the border. It's not just Shadow Creek. The mists. They've turned red. And there are figures in the trees. Masks of porcelain. Serpent masks." Alaric looked at Emily, then at the mark of the dagger on her shoulder, which was now a permanent, angry bruise. The escalation had begun. Magnus hadn't just sent a bride, he had sent a beacon, and the coven was coming to reclaim their prize. "Kyle," Alaric said, his voice terrifyingly calm, "sound the war horns. The silver moon goes to battle." He looked back at Emily, who was staring at her hands, as if she were seeing them for the first time. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I brought death to your gates." Alaric tilted her chin up. "No, Emily, you brought the light. And the dark is simply terrified of how brightly you're about to burn." The silver moon did not wait for the sun to rise to prepare for its defense. By noon, the obsidian halls of Blackwood Castle rang with the rhythmic clink, clink, clink of steel being sharpened and the heavy thud of supply crates being moved to the ramparts. The air was no longer filled with the scent of lavender. It was thick with the smell of sulfur, cold iron, and the electric tension of a pack preparing to bleed. In the great armory, Alaric stood shirtless, his back a map of muscles and battle scars that mirrored the violence of his history. He was strapping on his leather gambeson, his movements precise and mechanical. He was a king again, the man of ash and stone, but his eyes, now a permanent, restless gold, kept darting to the doorway. "You can't keep her in the panic room, Alaric," Kyle said, testing the tension on a heavy yew longbow. "She's the heart of this. The coven isn't here for your iron. They're here for the vessel." "She's not a vessel," Alaric snarled, the sound vibrating through the stone floor. "She's my wife, and I will not have her standing in the path of a shadow spear while she can barely shift her own weight." "She broke a blood seal that has been drinking her life for 20 years, Kyle countered softly. "She's stronger than you think, maybe stronger than both of us." Alaric tightened a buckle so hard the leather groaned. "I won't lose her, Kyle. Not when I've just begun to know the sound of her voice." He turned as a shadow fell across the threshold. Emily stood there, looking far removed from the girl in the gray lace. She was dressed in fitted midnight blue leathers, a gift from Mrs. Gable's private stores. Her hair, once dull and matted, was now a river of silk pinned back from her face. Her forest green eye was clear, but her violet one seemed to pulse with an inner light, as if a star were trapped behind the iris. In her hand, she clutched a short blade. She held it like a stranger, her fingers clumsy around the hilt. "I'm not going to the panic room," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. It was a quiet, steady flame. Alaric walked to her, his presence looming and massive. He took the blade from her hand, not to disarm her, but to look at it. "This is a Skinner's knife, Emily. It's for survival, not for war." "I have spent my entire life surviving," she replied, stepping into his space, defying the alpha aura that usually made others bow. "My father, the scullery, the whip, the coven, they all tried to make me small. If I hide now, I am helping them do it." Alaric felt the bond hum. It wasn't a whimper of fear. It was a low, possessive roar of pride. He reached out, his thumb brushing the line of her jaw. "The Red Witch of the Venom Coven is not a scullery maid, Emily. She will try to reach into your mind. She will try to use the bond between us to break you." "Then we will use the bond to break her," Emily said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the blue sea glass. It was pulsing in sync with her violet eye. "This isn't just a trinket. My mother, she was moon-blessed too. She told me the glass was a piece of the primal tide. I think she knew this day would come." Alaric took the sea glass, feeling the cool, ancient power radiating from it. He realized then that the ugly bride was gone. In her place was a woman reclaiming a throne she didn't even know she possessed. "If you stay," Alaric whispered, leaning his forehead against hers, "you stay by my side. Within my reach. If you are separated, you scream my name through the bond. Do you understand?" "I understand," she whispered back. The moment of peace was shattered by a horn, a long, mournful blast that sounded like the howl of a dying god. It came from the outer wall. "They're here!" Kyle shouted, grabbing his bow. Alaric grabbed his massive broadsword, the steel singing as it left the scabbard. He looked at Emily, his eyes burning gold. "Stay behind the shield line until I give the command. Ragnar is with you." They reached the ramparts just as the red mist began to spill over the valley floor. It wasn't weather, it was magic. It moved like a living thing, choking the trees, turning the vibrant green of the forest into a sickly, rusted gray. Through the mist, figures emerged, rogue wolves with eyes turned black by corruption, and mercenaries from Shadow Creek, their armor bearing Magnus's crest. But in the center, floating inches above the ground, was the true nightmare. A woman in flowing crimson robes, her face hidden behind a porcelain mask carved into the likeness of a weeping serpent. She held a staff of charred bone, and as she raised it, the red mist shrieked. "King Alaric!" The witch's voice didn't come from the air. It echoed inside their skulls, oily and cold. "Return the vessel. The mother serpent demands her tribute. Give us the girl, and we will leave your mountain standing. Refuse, and we will turn your pack into a graveyard of ash." Alaric stepped to the edge of the stone battlement, his voice a thunderous roar that shook the very mist. "You speak to the Lycan King. This mountain is built on the bones of those who tried to take what is mine. If you want the Queen of the Silver Moon, come and claim her through my heart." The witch laughed, a sound like glass breaking. She pointed her bone staff at the castle gates. "So be it." The red mist surged. The rogue wolves charged, their howls distorted and mechanical. The Silver Moon warriors met them with a wall of silver-tipped spears, the sound of the collision like a mountain collapsing. Alaric vaulted from the ramparts, shifting in midair. Ragnar, the midnight black wolf, hit the ground with the force of a meteor, his jaws instantly finding the throat of a corrupted rogue. From the wall, Emily watched the chaos. She felt the bond stretching, vibrating with Alaric's rage and pain. She saw the Red Witch raising her staff again, aiming not at the warriors, but at the foundations of the castle. "Luna," Emily whispered, calling to the wolf spirit within her. "I know you're tired. I know you're hungry, but we have to protect him." Inside her mind, the dark well began to glow. A pair of eyes, one green, one violet, opened in the abyss. The air around Emily began to shimmer. The sea glass in her hand grew hot, turning from blue to a blinding, radiant white. She didn't feel the cold anymore. She felt the primal tide rising in her blood, a force that had been suppressed for 20 years, now screaming for release. Down in the fray, Alaric was a whirlwind of black fur and blood. He was cutting a path toward the witch, but the red mist was thickening, binding his limbs, slowing his heart. He felt a sharp, psychic sting. Alaric, Emily's voice screamed in his mind. He looked up just in time to see the red witch vanish into a swirl of shadows, reappearing on the ramparts, directly behind Emily. The shield line had been breached. The guards were being swarmed by shadow wraiths. Emily was alone, the porcelain-masked woman looming over her like a vulture. "Small, broken thing," the witch hissed, her manicured hand reaching for Emily's throat. "Let us see what is left after we peel away your soul." Alaric let out a roar of pure agony, trying to turn, trying to reach her, but he was buried under a dozen corrupted wolves. The witch's hand closed around Emily's neck, but Emily didn't scream. She looked the witch in the porcelain eyes, her own violet eye flaring with the intensity of a dying sun. "I am not," Emily rasped, her hand closing around the sea glass and the witch's wrist at the same time, broken. A shockwave of violet light erupted from the ramparts, so powerful it cleared the red mist for 100 yards in every direction. The witch was thrown backward, her porcelain mask cracking, a scream of genuine shock escaping her lips. Emily stood at the edge of the wall, the sea glass glowing like a star in her palm, her hair whipping in a wind that shouldn't have existed. But as the light faded, a new sound began to rise from the valley. It wasn't the sound of wolves or witches. It was the sound of 1,000 heavy boots. From the tree line, a second army emerged. Not rogues, not mercenaries. These were the elite guard of the Gold Rock Pack, Seraphina's betrothed allies. The betrayal was complete. Alpha Magnus hadn't just sold Emily to the Coven. He had sold the entire North to the highest bidder. The arrival of the Gold Rock Pack changed the rhythm of the slaughter. Their banners, a golden fist against an ochre field, snapped in the mountain wind, a cruel irony against the darkening sky. They weren't here to assist a fellow Alpha in distress. They were here to scavenge the remains. "Magnus, you bastard," Alaric spat, his human voice returning as he shook off the last of the corrupted rogues. He stood in the center of a circle of broken bodies, his skin matted with soot and blood. He looked toward the tree line, where Alpha Magnus had finally emerged, flanked by the Alpha of Gold Rock, a man named Kalen, known for his cruelty and his thirst for expansion. "The treaty is void, Alaric," Magnus's voice carried across the field, amplified by a megaphone-like enchantment. He looked different, thinner, his eyes rimmed with a sickly yellow. The dark pact with the Coven was clearly taking its toll on the architect of the lie. "You took the iron, but you won't keep the source. The Gold Rock Pack will manage the Silver Moon territories under my guidance. Hand over the girl, and your warriors might live to see the dawn." Alaric didn't answer with words. He looked up at the ramparts. Emily was still standing where the violet blast had occurred. The Red Witch was recovering, her porcelain mask half shattered, revealing a face that was a roadmap of black, necrotized veins. The witch didn't care about Magnus's politics or Kalen's gold. She wanted the moon-blessed energy to stop the rot in her own skin. "Emily!" Alaric roared through the bond. "Jump." He didn't mean for her to fall to her death. He meant for her to trust the wind. Emily looked down at the chaos. She saw the Gold Rock warriors beginning to scale the outer walls. She saw Alaric, bloodied and exhausted, surrounded by a new wave of enemies. She felt the sea glass in her hand, vibrating so hard it felt like it would shatter her bones. "We're the tide, Emily." Luna's voice was no longer a whimper. It was a resonant, silver chime in her mind. "They want to cage the ocean. Show them what happens when the sea meets the shore." Emily didn't jump. She stepped forward, not off the wall, but into the center of the rampart's walkway. She closed her eyes and pressed the sea glass to the mark of the moon-blessed, her violet eye. The world went white. In her mind, she wasn't at Blackwood Castle. She was 5 years old, standing on a beach with a woman whose eyes were the color of the nebula. Her mother had held her hand, pressing the blue glass into her palm. "This is a piece of the first star that fell into the sea, Emily," her mother had whispered. "It remembers how to be whole. When the world tries to break you, remember the glass. It only becomes smooth because it refuses to disappear." On the battlefield, everyone froze. A low, melodic hum began to vibrate through the very stone of the mountain. It wasn't the sound of war. It was the sound of a song. Emily opened her eyes. Both were now glowing, the green and the violet, merging into a blinding teal radiance. She raised her hand, and the sea glass levitated above her palm, acting as a prism. The violet energy didn't explode this time. It flowed. It reached out like spectral vines, weaving through the silver moon warriors. Where it touched them, their wounds closed, and their exhaustion evaporated. But where it touched the corrupted rogues and the Gold Rock invaders, it felt like the weight of 1,000 years of winter. "The girl," Kalen of Gold Rock shouted, points his sword at the ramparts. "Kill the witch girl! Take her head!" A volley of arrows, tipped with Gold Rock fire, hissed through the air toward Emily. Alaric moved. He didn't shift back into the wolf. He stayed in his human form, his speed preternatural. He grabbed a discarded shield and vaulted up the stone stairs of the keep, his heart hammering a single word. No. 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 He reached the ramparts just as the first arrow struck, but it didn't hit Emily. It struck an invisible barrier of swirling jasmine and ozone, the scent of her power. The arrow disintegrated into ash. Alaric skidded to a halt beside her. He saw the strain on her face, the way her nose was beginning to bleed, the way her small frame was shaking under the pressure of hosting so much ancestral light. "Emily, stop!" he cried, grabbing her shoulders. "It's too much. You'll burn out." She turned to him, her eyes alien and ancient. "They are hurting my pack, Alaric. They are hurting you." "I'm a king of ash and stone, Emily," he said, his voice cracking with a raw, desperate sincerity. "I have survived 100 wars, but I cannot survive a world where you are the sacrifice. Let me carry the weight. That is what a mate is for." He took her hand, the one holding the light, and laced his fingers through hers. The connection was a physical impact. Alaric's gold aura met Emily's violet light, and for a heartbeat, the two of them were the only things that existed. The bond, once a jagged string of mistakes and fear, became a tether of pure incandescent steel. The Red Witch screamed, a sound of pure envy. She lunged, her bone staff glowing with a sickly crimson light, aiming for the spot where their hands met. "It belongs to the mother. It is not for a mongrel king and a broken doll." The staff struck the shield Alaric had raised, but the force of the dark magic was immense. It threw them both backward. They hit the stone floor of the high walkway, the sea glass skittering across the obsidian. The light in Emily's eyes flickered and died. She gasped, her lungs seizing. The witch stood over them, her mask now entirely gone, her face a horror of ancient rotting magic. She raised her staff for the killing blow. "Finish it!" Alpha Magnus's voice echoed from below, filled with a frantic, terrified greed. "Take the power. End them." But as the witch brought the staff down, A shadow fell over the walkway. It wasn't a wolf. It wasn't a warrior. It was the blue sea glass. It had stopped rolling at the very edge of the rampart, catching the last sliver of the setting sun. As the light hit the glass, it reflected a beam of pure, concentrated blue directly into the center of the witch's chest, the spot where her own stolen life force was anchored. The witch froze. Her eyes widened. The red light in her staff sputtered like a candle in a gale. "No," she whispered, her voice finally sounding human and utterly terrified. The tide is coming back." The sea glass didn't explode. It began to pull. Every ounce of magic the witch had stolen over the centuries, every life force she had siphoned, began to rush toward the tiny blue fragment. The air in the great hall screamed with the sound of 1,000 ghosts being released. The witch began to wither, her body turning to gray salt and blowing away in the mountain wind. Below, in the valley, the Gold Rock warriors saw their magical support vanish. The red mist evaporated, leaving them exposed to the full, rejuvenated fury of the Silver Moon Pack. But on the rampart, the silence was deafening. Emily lay in Alaric's arms, her breathing shallow, her eyes closed. The sea glass lay a few feet away, now dark and dull, its light spent. Alaric pulled her close, his tears hot against her cold skin. Emily, please. The war is over. Stay with me. Please stay." In the distance, the sounds of Magnus screaming as his own men turned on him faded into the wind. But Alaric didn't care about the victory. He only cared about the girl who had been sold as a curse and had become his only blessing. Emily's hand twitched. Her fingers sought his, find them in the dark. "The sharp parts," she whispered, her voice so faint he had to lean his ear to her lips. "What, Emily? What about them?" "They're gone, Alaric," she breathed, her forest green eye opening slowly, looking at him with a peace he had never seen. The glass. It made them smooth. She went limp again, and for a terrifying moment, Alaric thought the tide had finally taken her back to the sea. The silence that followed the Battle of Blackwood was not the empty silence of a graveyard, but the heavy, exhausted hush of a fever that had finally broken. The Gold Rock warriors had fled into the mists, their greed extinguished by the sight of the witch's disintegration. Below the ramparts, Kyle and the Silver Moon elite were rounding up the remnants of the Shadow Creek conspirators. But for Alaric, the world had shrunk to the space between his arms and the heart beating erratically against his own. He didn't wait for the healers. He carried Emily into the castle, his strides long and desperate. He bypassed the great hall, ignored the blood-stained tapestries, and took her straight to their room, the one with the moonstone hearth and the window that looked out over the northern peaks. "Mrs. Gable," he roared as he burst through the doors. The housekeeper was already there, her apron stained with soot, but her hand steady. She took one look at Emily's face, pale as bone, but no longer glowing with that terrifying, alien light, and pointed to the bed. "Lay her down, Alaric. Gently, now." She spent everything she had. For 3 days, the King of the North became a ghost in his own palace. He refused to sit on the obsidian throne. He refused to sign the revised treaties. He sat in a simple wooden chair by the bed, holding Emily's hand. He watched the way the firelight played over her features. Without the moon-blessed fever, she looked younger, softer. The violet eye was still there, but it was no longer a swirling nebula. It was just an eye, beautiful, rare, and deeply human. On the 4th morning, the sun broke through the mountain peaks with a clarity that felt like a blessing. Emily's fingers twitched against his. Alaric, who had been dozing in a half-wolf state, was instantly alert. "Emily." She blinked, her mismatched eyes struggling to focus on the heavy velvet canopy of the bed. She turned her head slowly, finding his face. A small, shaky smile touched her lips. "You're still here," she whispered, her voice no longer rusty, but clear and soft as falling snow. "I'm never going anywhere else," Alaric said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. He brought her hand to his lips, kissing the knuckles that were finally starting to heal. "The healers say the seal is gone, truly gone. The witch took the shadow with her when she withered. You are just Emily now." Emily sat up slowly, assisted by Alaric's steady arm. She looked toward the window. "And my father?" Alaric's expression hardened, but only for a second. "He and Serafina were found at the border. The Gold Rock Alpha didn't take kindly to Magnus's failure. He stripped them of their dignity and left them for us to deal with." "What will you do?" Alaric looked at her, searching for the spark of the girl who had been whipped in the scullery. "The council wants their heads on the border spikes, Emily. They want blood for the betrayal. But I am the king, and you are the queen. The decision is yours." Emily was silent for a long time. She looked at the blue sea glass sitting on the nightstand. It was no longer a magical conduit. It was just a piece of glass, worn smooth by the sea, beautiful because it had survived. "Exile," she said finally. "Strip them of the Vance name. Strip them of their wolves, if the high priest can perform the rite. Let them live as humans in the lowlands, where no one knows their titles and no one fears their name. Let them work the land, as I worked their floors. Death is too quick, Alaric. Life is where you learn who you really are." Alaric nodded, a deep respect for her mercy and her justice settling in his soul. It is done. Weeks passed. The Silver Moon territory began to heal. The iron mines were reopened, not through a blood debt, but through fair trade with the northern clans. The ugly bride was a legend now, but not for her face. The people spoke of the queen, who had turned a storm into a song. One evening, as the first snow of winter began to dust the obsidian towers of the castle, Alaric found Emily in the glass-walled conservatory. She wasn't scrubbing the floors. She was standing by a cluster of winter jasmines, her hair loose and flowing down her back. Alaric approached her quietly. He no longer projected the alpha's weight. He walked with the lightness of a man who had finally found his anchor. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "We never had a proper wedding," he said, standing behind her. "Only a transaction at an altar of ash." He opened the box. Inside was a ring of white gold, set with a single polished piece of the blue sea glass, surrounded by tiny, brilliant diamonds. "The sea glass," Emily whispered, taking the box. "I asked the royal jeweler to set it," Alaric said. "It reminded me of what you said, that the sharp parts go away if you hold on long enough. I spent my life being sharp, Emily. I spent my life being a blade for my people to use. You made me smooth." He took the ring and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Emily turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had frozen when he lifted her veil, not because of a curse, but because his soul had recognized its mirror. She reached up, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, no longer flinching, no longer afraid. "I used to hate the rain," she whispered, leaning her forehead against his, "because it meant the tower, would be cold and the floors would be wet. But now, when I hear the rain on the roof, I just think of the scent of cedar and jasmine." Alaric wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into the warmth of his chest. Outside, the world was white and silent, the war a distant memory. The king and his moon-blessed queen stood in the quiet light, two broken things that had found a way to be whole, not through magic, but through the simple human act of choosing to stay. The violet eye and the green eye looked into the gold ones, and in that reflection, there was no more shadow. There was only the dawn. In the end, the legend of the Lycan King and his moon-blessed queen wasn't written in the blood of their enemies, but in the quiet peace of the years that followed. Thank you for walking this path with me. If Emily's journey from a hidden scullery to a beloved throne resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe to join our pack. Your support allows us to keep bringing these cinematic tales to life. As the fire in the hearth dims, we leave them there, hand in hand, watching the first snow fall, finally home.